In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where alien civilizations measure courage in calculated risks and strategic retreats, there exists a species that defies all logic: humanity. They call it the human condition, this inexplicable drive to run toward danger when every rational being runs away. But what happens when that very instinct, that reckless bravery that makes other species whisper our name in equal parts terror and admiration, becomes the key to unlocking the greatest mystery in galactic history? Commander Sarah-chan thought she was just saving her cadets from a training accident gone wrong. She had no idea she was about to become the most important human who ever lived, or that her actions would reveal why humanity's greatest heroes never truly die. Some say courage is knowing the odds and acting anyway. Others believe it's too stupid to calculate the risk. But in the hero archives, where the impossible becomes inevitable, courage is something else entirely. It's immortal. The training facility on Kepler 442b was supposed to be the safest place in the galaxy. Built by the Zinthri Engineering Collective, beings who calculated safety margins down to the 15th decimal place. The complex had never experienced so much as a minor equipment malfunction in its 47 years of operation. Until today, Commander Sarah-chan pressed her face against the observation deck's reinforced glass, watching her cadets navigate the simulated battlefield below. 23 young humans, the cream of the Terran Defense Academy, moved through the holographic war zone with the fluid precision that made their alien instructors both proud and deeply uncomfortable. Humans learned warfare too quickly, adapted too easily to violence that should have taken years to master. They're improving faster than our projections indicated, observed Instructor Theclon, his chitinous mandibles clicking nervously. The arachnid had been training soldiers for 3 centuries, but human students still unnerved him. Perhaps we should increase the difficulty parameters. Sarah nodded, her dark eyes tracking Cadet Martinez as he led his squad through a particularly challenging urban combat scenario. The young man moved with a confidence that would have taken other species decades to develop. Do it. They can handle more. That was humanity's blessing and curse. They could always handle more. More pressure, more pain, more impossible odds. It was what made them the galaxy's most effective peacekeepers and its most feared warriors. Other species fought when they had to. Humans fought because they could. The simulation was a recreation of the Battle of Proxima Station, where human forces had held off a Vorthan invasion fleet for 6 months with nothing but outdated equipment and raw determination. It was the kind of impossible victory that had become synonymous with human military history, the kind that made alien strategists throw up their appendages in frustration because it shouldn't have worked. Cadet Thompson, barely 19 and fresh from the agricultural colonies, threw himself behind cover as holographic plasma bolts scorched the air around him. His squad moved to support him immediately. No hesitation, no calculation of personal risk. It was instinctive, this willingness to die for each other, and it terrified their alien allies almost as much as it inspired them. Fascinating, murmured Theclon. Look at how they coordinate without communication. It's as if they share a collective consciousness. Sarah smiled grimly. We call it brotherhood. It's not telepathy, it's trust. The concept of trust had been difficult to explain to the galactic community. Most species required years of careful relationship building, contracts, and genetic compatibility tests before they would rely on someone else for survival. Humans just did it. They met, they fought together, they bled together, and suddenly they would die for each other without question. The simulation was reaching its climax when everything went wrong. It started with a flicker in the holographic displays, barely noticeable at first. Then, the environmental controls began fluctuating wildly. Temperature readings spiked across the facility's monitoring systems, and the air recycling units started working overtime. What's happening? Sarah demanded, moving to the central control panel where multiple Zenthri technicians were frantically manipulating their interfaces with all 6 of their delicate appendages. Tech Prime Vexhi's translator crackled with static as stress pheromones flooded from her pores. Unknown system cascade failure. The quantum matrix maintaining the training environment is destabilizing. We cannot identify the cause. Below them, the cadets continued their exercise, unaware that their holographic battlefield was becoming increasingly real. The simulated explosions were generating actual heat now. The plasma rounds were gaining physical properties, and the artificial atmosphere was becoming toxic. "Shut it down," Sarah ordered. "Emergency protocols now." "We cannot," Vexhi replied, her voice high with panic. "The safety overrides are not responding. The quantum matrix has achieved some form of self-sustaining reaction. The entire facility is beginning to phase shift between dimensions." Sarah stared at the readings in horror. A dimensional phase shift was theoretical death sentence, the kind of accident that claimed entire star systems when experimental technology went wrong. The training facility was tearing itself apart on a quantum level, and her cadets were trapped in the center of it. "Evacuation protocols," she snapped. "Get everyone out. Now. Impossible dès que l'on clique mon folie." The phase shift has created a dimensional barrier. Nothing can enter or leave the training area until the reaction burns itself out. Our calculations suggest this will take approximately 14 hours. The atmospheric toxicity will kill them in 2. Sarah looked down at her cadets, still fighting their simulated battle, still trusting that the adults watching over them would keep them safe. Martinez was helping Thompson to his feet after a particularly challenging obstacle. Rodriguez was sharing her rations with Jackson, who had forgotten his pack. They were taking care of each other, the way humans always did, completely unaware that they were about to die. 23 young people who had trusted her to train them, to prepare them for the dangers of military service. Instead, she had led them into a death trap created by technology so advanced she couldn't even pronounce its name correctly. "There has to be something," she said, studying the readings. "Some way to get them out." The alien technicians exchanged glances that needed no translation. They had run every calculation, considered every possibility. The mathematics were absolute. There was no solution. But Sarah Chun had not earned her command by accepting the impossible. She had earned it by finding the solutions that others couldn't see, by asking the questions that others wouldn't ask. "What about environmental suits?" she asked. If someone could get inside, could they protect the cadets long enough for the reaction to burn out? The dimensional barriers would prevent any suit from functioning, Vexhi explained patiently. The quantum flux would disrupt all electronic systems within the affected area. Anyone who entered would be as helpless as the cadets. But they would survive the atmospheric toxicity? For a time, yes, but how long? Fecklon's mandibles clicked rapidly as he calculated. Perhaps 3 to 4 hours before suit failure. But, as I explained, the barriers prevent entry. What if someone was already inside when the barriers formed? The alien instructors looked at each other, then at Sarah, understanding dawning in their non-human features. "Commander," Fecklon said slowly, "the observation deck is technically within the affected area. The barriers formed around the entire training complex, not just the ground-level facility." Sarah looked around the control room, noting for the first time the subtle shimmer in the air that indicated dimensional instability. They were all trapped inside the reaction zone. The only difference was that the observation deck still had breathable air for now. How long before the toxicity reaches this level? 37 minutes, Vexhi calculated. The vertical air circulation patterns will carry the contamination upward gradually. Sarah nodded, her mind racing. 37 minutes to save 23 people with nothing but environmental suits that would fail in 4 hours, in a facility that was tearing itself apart on levels of reality she barely understood. Any rational being would recognize the impossibility of the situation and begin preparing for death. They would calculate the odds, analyze the options, and conclude that sacrifice was pointless when it could not achieve survival. But Sarah Chun was human, and humans had never been accused of being rational. She moved to the emergency equipment lockers, and began pulling out environmental suits. Vex High, I need you to monitor the dimensional fluctuations and give me real-time updates on safe movement corridors. Theclon, track the atmospheric contamination patterns and find me the safest route to the cadets. Commander, Theclon protested. Even if you reach them, you cannot save them. The environmental suits will only delay the inevitable. Maybe, Sarah admitted, sealing her suit and checking its systems. But 14 hours is a long time. A lot can change in 14 hours. She looked down at her cadets one more time. They had stopped their exercise now, finally noticing that something was wrong. Martinez was checking his readings, probably wondering why his equipment was malfunctioning. Rodriguez was looking up at the observation deck, trying to signal for instructions. They trusted her. They believed she would find a way to keep them safe, because that's what human commanders did. They found ways when there were no ways. They made the impossible possible through sheer bloody-minded refusal to accept defeat. Sarah had no idea how she was going to save them. She only knew that she was going to try, because that's what humans did. They tried when trying was pointless. They fought when fighting was hopeless. They stood up when standing up meant certain death. Open the access hatch, she ordered. I'm going down there. The last thing she heard before entering the poison air of the training facility was Vex High's translator crackling with disbelief. Humans are truly insane. Sarah smiled inside her helmet. That was the nicest thing anyone had said about her species all day. The journey down to the training level should have taken 3 minutes. In the dimensional instability of the phase shift, it took 27. Reality folded and twisted around Sarah as she descended, corridors stretching into impossible distances before snapping back to normal. Gravity shifted directions without warning, and at one point, she found herself walking on what had been a wall moments before. The environmental suit's systems screamed warnings about quantum flux exposure, dimensional radiation, and atmospheric toxicity levels that registered as immediately fatal. Sarah ignored them all. Human commanders had been ignoring impossible readings for centuries. It was practically a job requirement. When she finally reached the training floor, she found her cadets huddled together in the center of the facility, their training weapons discarded as they tried to make sense of equipment that no longer obeyed the laws of physics. The holographic battlefield had become a nightmare landscape of half-real obstacles and phantom enemies that couldn't be fought because they existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Commander, Martinez called out as he spotted her approaching through the dimensional haze. What's happening? Our equipment is showing readings that don't make sense. Quantum phase shift, Sarah explained, her voice crackling through the suit's comm system. The facility is experiencing a dimensional cascade failure. The entire structure is unstable. She could see the understanding in their young faces, the recognition that this was no longer a training exercise. These were some of the brightest minds humanity had produced, accepted into the Terran Defense Academy, based on intelligence as much as courage. They knew what a dimensional cascade failure meant. Are we going to die, ma'am? Cadet Kim asked quietly. At 17, she was the youngest of the group, recruited from the lunar colonies after scoring perfect marks on every aptitude test the Academy had ever developed. Sarah looked at the young faces surrounding her, these children who had volunteered to serve, who had trusted the Academy to prepare them for service and trusted her to keep them alive during that preparation. The environmental readings were getting worse by the minute. The dimensional barriers that trapped them showed no signs of weakening. The quantum reaction that powered the cascade failure was still building towards some unimaginable climax. Any other species would have spent these final hours in prayer or meditation, accepting the inevitability of death with philosophical grace. They would have calculated the precise time of their demise and used their remaining moments to say goodbye to loved ones or complete final tasks. But these were human children, and Sarah was a human commander, and humans had never accepted the inevitable without a fight. No, she said firmly. We're not going to die. We're going to survive this because that's what humans do. We survive impossible situations by making them possible. She had no plan. She had no solution. She had nothing but 23 environmental suits, a training facility that was coming apart at the seams of reality, and the absolute certainty that giving up was not an option. But as she looked into the eyes of her cadets, eyes bright with fear, but also with trust, with the absolute faith that their commander would find a way, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope, exactly, but something deeper and more primal. It was the feeling that had driven humans across the galaxy, that had made them the peacekeepers and protectors of countless worlds despite being one of the youngest species in galactic civilization. It was the thing that made other species shake their heads in disbelief and whisper about human madness. It was the absolute refusal to let the people counting on you down, no matter what the odds, no matter what the cost. Sarah began distributing environmental suits to her cadets, helping them into the complex alien technology while the facility continued its slow dissolution around them. She had maybe 2 hours before the suits began failing, maybe 14 hours before the dimensional cascade burned itself out. It should have been hopeless. By every rational calculation, it was hopeless. But Sarah Chun had never been accused of being rational. And as she sealed the helmet on Cadet Martinez's suit, she began to plan for the impossible. The first environmental suit failure came exactly 3 hours and 47 minutes after Sarah had reached her cadets. Cadet Henderson's atmospheric recycler gave out with a soft whine that sounded like a dying animal in the toxic air of the training facility. Sarah watched the young man's face through his helmet visor as the reality of his situation dawned on him. Henderson was 19, from the mining colonies of Tau Ceti, and had enlisted because he wanted to see the galaxy. Now he was going to die in a training facility that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously, choking on air that shouldn't have been able to exist. "Ma'am," Henderson said quietly over the comm system, "my recycler is down. Backup systems show maybe 20 minutes of stored air." The other cadets turned to look at their commander, waiting for orders that couldn't exist. Sarah's own suit readings showed she had maybe 30 minutes before her primary systems failed. Around them, the facility continued its impossible dance between dimensions, walls shifting in and out of reality while the quantum cascade reaction built towards some unknowable crescendo. 23 cadets had trusted her to keep them alive. In approximately 4 hours, she had managed to extend their lives by a total of 3 hours and 47 minutes. By any rational measure, she had failed completely. But failure wasn't a concept that humans accepted easily, especially when it involved people under their command. Henderson switched to emergency protocols, Sarah ordered, moving to the young cadet's position. Minimal breathing, controlled panic response. "We're going to get you more air." "How, ma'am?" Martinez asked from across their small circle. As senior cadet, he had been helping coordinate the group's survival efforts, rationing their water supplies, and monitoring suit systems with the methodical precision of a born leader. The environmental systems are all failing at the projected intervals. There's no additional oxygen source. Sarah looked around at her cadets, these young people who had been laughing and joking during their training exercise just hours earlier. Now they faced death with the kind of calm acceptance that would have impressed alien philosophers twice their age. Not because they were ready to die, but because they trusted their commander to find another option. The terrible thing was, Sarah could see exactly what that option had to be. The suits were failing in order of manufacture, with the oldest models giving out first. Her own suit was military-grade, newer, and more robust than the training suits issued to cadets. It would last perhaps 6 hours longer than theirs, which meant Sarah could watch every single one of her people die before her own systems failed. Or, "Henderson," she said quietly, "prepare for emergency air transfer." The young cadet looked up at her in confusion. "Mom?" "Emergency air transfer," Sarah repeated, beginning to unlock her helmet seals. "I'm giving you my primary air supply. My suit has enough backup systems to last until your recycler can be repaired." It was a lie, and everyone in the circle knew it. Emergency air transfers were theoretical procedures for extreme situations, designed to buy a few extra minutes of life at the cost of the donor's survival. Sarah's backup systems would give her maybe 40 minutes after the transfer, not the hours needed for equipment repair. "Commander, no," Martinez said firmly. "That's a suicide order. We can't accept it." "It's not a suicide order," Sarah replied, continuing her helmet preparations. "It's a resource reallocation directive. I'm extending the operational capacity of this unit by optimizing air distribution." The military terminology was a thin disguise for what was actually happening, and her cadets weren't fooled. These were some of the brightest young minds humanity had produced. They understood exactly what their commander was proposing to do. "Ma'am," Cadet Rodriguez spoke up. "With respect, that's the stupidest plan I've ever heard." Sarah paused in her preparations, looking at the young woman through her visor. Rodriguez was from the urban centers of Mars, street-smart and practical, with a talent for logistics that had made her invaluable during training exercises. She was also completely correct about the stupidity of Sarah's plan. "Do you have a better suggestion, Cadet?" "Yes, ma'am. We fix Henderson's recycler instead of killing you." Sarah almost smiled. "With what equipment?" "The dimensional flux has disabled all our repair tools. The recycler requires component replacement, and we don't have spare parts." "Then we make them," Rodriguez said simply. It should have been impossible. The environmental suits were built by the Curlian Industrial Consortium, a species that manufactured technology with tolerances measured in subatomic units. The recycling systems contained rare earth elements that didn't exist naturally on most planets, assembled with precision tools that required clean room environments and anti-grav manufacturing pods. But Rodriguez was already moving, pulling components from her own suit's secondary systems with the kind of casual confidence that made alien engineers weep. Martinez joined her, followed by Thompson and Kim, and within minutes half the cadets were disassembling their equipment with the cheerful incompetence that characterized human interaction with advanced technology. "What are you doing?" Sarah demanded, watching her carefully trained soldiers turn their life support systems into something that looked like a mechanical explosion. "Improvising, ma'am," Martinez replied, using his combat knife to pry a circuit board loose from Thompson's suit controller. "It's kind of a human specialty." Sarah watched in fascination as her cadets began creating something that definitely wasn't in any technical manual she had ever read. They were using Thompson's atmospheric sensors as processing elements, Rodriguez's backup power cells as pumps, and Kim's emergency beacon as some kind of filtration system. The entire assembly was held together with emergency tape, prayer, and the kind of optimistic engineering that made alien technical consultants refuse to work with human clients. "This can't possibly work," Sarah said, staring at their creation. "Probably not," Rodriguez agreed, connecting the last few components with confident movements. "But it might work long enough to matter." The improvised recycler looked like something a child might build from spare parts found in a junkyard. It violated approximately 14 different engineering principles and at least 3 laws of physics. When they activated it, it made sounds that no atmospheric recycling system should ever make, including a high-pitched, whining noise that suggested imminent mechanical failure. But Henderson's suit readings showed breathable air flowing into his system. "I don't believe it," Sarah whispered, watching the impossible device somehow sustain human life with components that had never been designed to work together. "Human engineering, ma'am," Martinez said proudly. "We specialize in making things work that shouldn't work." It was true. Throughout galactic history, human technology had been characterized by its complete disregard for proper engineering principles. Where other species designed systems with careful redundancy and precise tolerances, humans built things that held together through force of will and judicious application of percussive maintenance. The Zen-3 had once spent 6 months studying a human starship engine that had been running continuously for 40 years despite having 3 major components that were technically impossible. Their final report concluded that human technology functioned on principles that violated several fundamental laws of thermodynamics, and recommended that no rational being should ever attempt to understand it. But the improvised recycler was working, and Henderson was breathing clean air again, and Sarah felt something she had almost forgotten in the past few hours: hope. That hope lasted exactly 17 minutes, until Cadet Jackson's suit systems began their failure cascade. "Ma'am," Jackson reported with the calm professionalism that the Academy drilled into all its students, "I'm showing multiple system failures. Primary recycler, backup atmospheric processor, and emergency oxygen reserve. About maybe 10 minutes of breathing room." Sarah looked at their improvised repair station. The components they had used to save Henderson were now incorporated into his life support system, no longer available for other repairs. They could build another device, but it would require cannibalizing more equipment from other suits, which would bring those systems closer to their own failure points. It was a mathematical problem with no solution. 23 people, limited resources, and a steadily decreasing supply of functional equipment. No matter how they allocated their assets, the math led to the same conclusion. Some of them were going to die, unless they changed the fundamental parameters of the problem. "Jackson," Sarah said quietly, "you're going to share my air supply directly." "Mom." "Physical connection. We link our suits together so you can breathe off my recycler until we can repair yours." It was another impossible solution, the kind of field modification that would make safety inspectors cry. Environmental suits weren't designed for direct connection. The pressure differentials and contamination risks made shared breathing systems extraordinarily dangerous. But Jackson was going to die without it, and Sarah had learned long ago that dangerous options were better than no options at all. The connection procedure took 8 minutes, which left Jackson with approximately 2 minutes of air reserves when they finished. Sarah had to physically crawl to his position and link their suits with an emergency umbilical that was designed for equipment transfer, not human respiration. When Jackson took his first breath of shared air, his relief was visible even through the helmet visor. But Sarah's suit readings immediately showed the strain of supporting 2 people with systems designed for one. Her recycler was working at 140% of rated capacity. Her power reserves were draining faster than recommended, and her mobility was limited by the physical connection between them. It was a temporary solution at best, but temporary was better than dead. "Rodriguez," Sarah ordered, "start working on Jackson's recycler. Martinez, check everyone else's system status. I want to know when the next failure is coming." "Aye, ma'am," they responded, moving with the efficient teamwork that made human units so effective in crisis situations. As Rodriguez began disassembling Jackson's suit systems, Sarah found herself wondering how long they could sustain this improvised survival system. Each repair required components from other suits. Each shared connection put additional strain on working systems, and the facility around them showed no signs of stabilizing. The quantum cascade reaction was still building. The dimensional barriers showed no weakness, and according to her suit's chronometer, they had been trapped for less than half the estimated duration of the crisis. They were already cannibalizing their equipment just to keep 2 people alive. How were they supposed to sustain 23 for another 10 hours? The answer came from Cadet Kim, barely 17, and technically the youngest person in the facility. "Commander," she said quietly, "I've been monitoring the dimensional fluctuations in the facility structure. I think I might know why the cascade reaction isn't burning out." Sarah looked at the young woman through her visor. Kim was from the lunar research colonies, raised by parents who designed experimental spacecraft engines. She had an intuitive understanding of advanced physics that made her academy instructors nervous, because she could solve problems without fully understanding the mathematics behind the solutions. "Explain." "The reaction isn't self-sustaining," Kim said, pulling up readings on her suit's display system. "It's being fed by an external power source. Something is deliberately maintaining the dimensional instability." Sarah stared at the readings Kim was showing her. The energy patterns were too regular, too controlled to be random chaos. Someone or something was actively managing the cascade reaction, keeping it stable enough to trap them, but unstable enough to prevent escape. Who would do that? Martinez asked. And why? It was a good question, but Sarah already knew the answer. She had seen energy signatures like this before during her service with the Deep Space Reconnaissance Corps. The patterns were familiar because she had encountered them during humanity's first contact with one of the galaxy's most mysterious species. The Architects, she said quietly. The name sent a chill through the group. Every cadet at the academy knew about the Architects, the ancient species that had supposedly built most of the galaxy's inexplicable phenomena before disappearing millions of years ago. They were legends, myths, the answer scientists gave when they couldn't explain something impossible. Except Sarah had met them once, briefly, during a reconnaissance mission to the Galactic Core. They weren't myths. They were very real, incredibly powerful, and absolutely insane by any rational standard. Why would the Architects trap us in a training facility? Rodriguez asked. Sarah looked around at her cadets, these young humans who were dying one by one in a situation that made no sense, and began to understand what was really happening. The Cascade failure hadn't been an accident. The dimensional barriers weren't a malfunction. The entire situation had been carefully engineered to create one specific scenario. Humans facing impossible odds with no hope of rescue. It was a test. But a test of what? And for what purpose? I don't know, Sarah admitted. But I'm going to find out. She began examining the facility's quantum readings more carefully, looking for patterns that might reveal the true nature of their prison. If the Architects had created this situation deliberately, then there had to be a purpose behind it. And if there was a purpose, then there might be a way out. But first, she had to keep her people alive long enough to find it. Jackson's improvised recycler repair was holding, but barely. Henderson's jury-rigged system was showing strain patterns that suggested failure within the hour. And, according to Martinez's system checks, 3 more cadets were approaching critical failure points. 23 lives, depending on her ability to solve a puzzle created by beings whose technology was indistinguishable from magic, in a facility that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, while jury-rigging life support systems that violated every engineering principle she had ever learned. Sarah Chan had commanded troops through hostile alien territory, navigated first contact scenarios with species that communicated through controlled hallucinations, and once spent 6 months keeping a deep space research station operational with nothing but spare parts and stubborn determination. But this was different. This was personal. These weren't just troops under her command. They were children who had trusted her to keep them safe. And she was failing them, one environmental suit failure at a time. Unless she could figure out what the Architects wanted from them before her cadets started dying faster than she could save them. The breakthrough came when Cadet Williams died. Sarah had been working frantically to jury-rig another atmospheric recycler when a young man's systems finally gave out. Williams was 20 from the agricultural worlds of Kepler, 186, and had joined the academy because he wanted to protect the farming colonies that had raised him. He died quietly, without drama, slipping into unconsciousness as his air supply ran out. But instead of staying dead, something impossible happened. The dimensional flux around Williams' body began to intensify, reality bending and twisting in patterns that made Sarah's eyes water. The air shimmered like heat distortion, space folded in on itself, and for just a moment, Williams seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously. Then he opened his eyes and sat up. That was interesting, Williams said, his voice coming through the comm system despite the fact that his suit had completely failed minutes earlier. I can see why the Architects find human death so fascinating. Sarah stared at the young man who should have been dead, whose body showed no signs of life support function, who was somehow breathing the toxic atmosphere that had been killing them all day. Williams? She asked uncertainly. In a sense, the cadet replied, standing with fluid movements that seemed too graceful for someone wearing a failed environmental suit. But also more than Williams and less. I am what he became when he refused to accept death. The other cadets gathered around their seemingly resurrected comrade, their faces showing the kind of wonder and terror that humans reserve for encounters with the truly inexplicable. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the facility's failing environmental systems. "You're an architect," she said. "I am what humans become when they transcend the limitations of linear existence." "The thing that had been," Williams replied. "Your species calls us architects because you need names for things you don't understand. But we are not alien to you. We are what you become when you refuse to let death be the end of the story." Sarah looked around at the facility with new understanding. The dimensional instability, the quantum cascade reaction, the carefully controlled environment that kept them trapped but alive, it was all designed to create the specific conditions that had just transformed Williams. "You're collecting us," she realized. "Human minds that refuse to give up, even when giving up is the rational choice." "Preserving," the Williams thing corrected. "Your species produces individuals who transcend normal limitations through sheer force of will. When they die in service to others, when they sacrifice themselves for causes larger than their individual survival, they become something more than human. We preserve those transformations." The facility around them began to shift, walls becoming transparent to reveal vast archives stretching into impossible distances. Sarah saw thousands of figures suspended in crystalline chambers, humans from throughout galactic history who had died performing acts of heroism that defied rational explanation. "The hero archives," she whispered, recognizing some of the figures from Academy history courses. Commander Torres, who had held the Vorthan invasion fleet at Proxima Station. Captain Harrison, who had single-handedly evacuated a failing colony ship. Lieutenant Parker, who had saved her entire platoon by manually detonating a fusion reactor. Heroes who refused to let their stories end with death, the Williams entity explained. Humans whose courage transcended physical existence and became something eternal. Sarah understood now why the training exercise had been chosen for this test. It recreated the exact conditions that produce human heroes, impossible odds, lives at stake, and the absolute certainty that giving up meant watching people die. "But Williams isn't dead," she protested. "He's right here, talking to us." "Death is a transition, not an ending, for minds that refuse to accept limitations," the entity replied. Williams chose to continue existing rather than surrender to biological failure. He transformed rather than terminating. It should have been terrifying. The implications of what she was seeing. Humans who had somehow continued to exist after death through pure force of will. Challenged everything she thought she knew about life, death, and the nature of consciousness itself. But Sarah Chen had spent her career dealing with the impossible, and she had more immediate concerns than philosophical implications. "If you can transform humans who refuse to die, can you save my cadets?" The Williams entity tilted its head with an expression that was almost recognizably human. "They are not dead. Transformation requires the transition between states. Your cadets are still fighting to survive." "Then, help them survive," Sarah demanded. "Give them the air they need, repair their equipment, stabilize the facility. You have the power." "We have the power," the entity agreed. "But intervention would prevent the transformation. Heroes are not created through divine assistance. They emerge from the absolute refusal to surrender when surrender is the only rational option." Sarah looked around at her remaining cadets, still working frantically to repair failing equipment with improvised solutions that violated every engineering principle she knew. Henderson and Jackson were sharing their jury-rigged atmospheric recycler. Rodriguez was dismantling her backup power systems to keep Kim's suit functional. Martinez was coordinating their efforts with the calm professionalism of a born leader, despite knowing that their situation was hopeless. They were dying one by one, and the only beings capable of saving them refused to interfere with the process that would ultimately transform them into something beyond human. "This is insane," Sarah said. "You're watching children die, so you can collect their minds for some cosmic museum. We are preserving the greatest achievements of human consciousness," the Williams entity replied. Your species produces individuals who transcend normal limitations through courage and sacrifice. When they die in service to others, they become eternal examples of what sentient life can achieve. They don't want to be eternal examples, Sarah snapped. They want to live. They want to go home to their families, to see their worlds again, to have normal lives with normal problems. And yet they continue fighting for each other's survival despite knowing the futility of their efforts, the entity observed. They choose courage over comfort, sacrifice over safety, hope over rational calculation. This is what makes them worthy of preservation. Sarah looked at Cadet Kim, barely 17, and working with desperate concentration to repair Thompson's failing atmosphere processor. The young woman had solved the mystery of the dimensional cascade reaction, identified the external power source, and figured out why their equipment was failing in predictable patterns. She could have used that intelligence to calculate exactly when she was going to die, but instead she was using it to keep her fellow cadets alive for as long as possible. It was quintessentially human behavior, using superior intellect not to escape impossible situations, but to drag other people through them as well. You want heroes? Sarah asked the Williams entity. Then, let me make you a deal. The transformed cadet regarded her with interest that felt distinctly inhuman despite the familiar face. Humans do not negotiate with forces beyond their comprehension. Sure we do, Sarah replied. We've been negotiating with alien species, cosmic phenomena, and impossible odds since we first left Earth. It's what we do when we can't shoot our way out of a problem. She gestured toward her remaining cadets, still working with desperate efficiency to solve problems that had no solutions. You want to preserve human heroism? Then let them choose. Don't kill them slowly and transform them when they die fighting impossible odds. Show them what transformation means and let them decide for themselves. Transformation cannot be chosen, the entity explained patiently. It emerges from the absolute refusal to surrender when surrender is the only rational option. Choice implies alternatives, which negates the conditions necessary for transcendence. But they're not choosing to give up now, Sarah pointed out. They're choosing to keep fighting despite knowing they can't win. That's the same thing. The Williams entity was quiet for a long moment, considering her words with the kind of careful attention that suggested vast intelligence, processing concepts it had never encountered before. You propose that conscious choice to continue fighting hopeless battles is equivalent to unconscious refusal to accept death. I propose that my cadets are already heroes, Sarah said firmly. They just haven't died yet. And maybe dying isn't what makes them heroic. Maybe it's the choice to keep fighting for each other when fighting is pointless. Around them, the facility continued its dimensional dance, walls shifting between states of reality while the quantum cascade reaction maintained its careful balance between stability and chaos. The preserved heroes in their crystalline chambers seemed to watch with timeless attention as Sarah negotiated for the lives of her students. Your proposition has merit, the entity admitted, but it violates the fundamental parameters of hero identification. Sacrifice requires loss. Courage requires risk. Transcendence requires transformation. Then, let them choose the sacrifice, Sarah suggested. Let them choose the risk. Let them choose the transformation. Don't make the choice for them by creating impossible situations. She looked around at her cadets, these young people who had volunteered to serve, who had trusted the academy to prepare them properly, who had trusted her to lead them safely through their training. Williams chose to continue existing rather than die, she continued. But he made that choice in the moment of transition. What if they could make that choice before the transition? What if they could choose to become something more than human while they were still alive to understand what they were choosing? The entity that had been Williams studied her with eyes that held depths no human gaze should possess. You would offer them immortality in exchange for their humanity? I would offer them the choice, Sarah corrected. The same choice Williams made, but with full knowledge of what it means. They could choose to live normal human lives, or they could choose to become eternal guardians of human courage. But it would be their choice, not yours. It was a desperate gambit, the kind of impossible negotiation that humans had been conducting with superior forces since they first encountered alien technology that worked on principles they couldn't understand. Sarah had no idea if the architects could even comprehend the concept of voluntary transformation, or if they would consider it a valid alternative to their current collection methods. But her environmental suit readings showed that she had maybe 20 minutes of air remaining. 3 more cadets were approaching critical system failure, and their improvised repair solutions were breaking down faster than they could build new ones. She was running out of time, running out of options, and running out of people to save. The choice you describe is unprecedented, the Williams entity said finally. We have never encountered beings who could voluntarily transcend their limitations while retaining conscious awareness of the transformation process. Because you've never asked them, Sarah replied. You've been collecting heroes after they die, preserving their courage in crystalline chambers. But what if you could work with them while they're still alive? What if heroism isn't something you preserve, but something you partner with? The facility around them shuddered as dimensional forces beyond Sarah's comprehension wrestled with concepts they had never been required to process. The quantum cascade reaction fluctuated wildly, reality bending and twisting as vast intelligences considered possibilities they had never imagined. Finally, the Williams entity spoke. We will offer your cadets the choice, it said. They may choose to continue their human existence, accepting the limitations and mortality that define your species. Or they may choose transformation, becoming eternal guardians of human courage with the power to prevent future generations from facing the impossible odds that created them. Sarah felt a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying lift from her shoulders. It wasn't victory. There was no guarantee her cadets would choose survival over transcendence. No certainty that voluntary transformation was even possible. But it was a choice which was all humans had ever really wanted when facing forces beyond their comprehension. And if they choose to remain human, then they will be returned safely to your academy, with full memory of these events, and the knowledge that they chose ordinary life over extraordinary existence. Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. Her cadets would remember that they had been offered immortality, power, and the chance to become eternal examples of human heroism. And they would remember that they had chosen simple human life instead. It would change them, even if they remained entirely human. But that was a problem for future Sarah to worry about. Present Sarah had 22 living cadets and an entity of unimaginable power that was willing to let them choose their own fate. For humans, that was about as good as negotiations with cosmic forces ever got. The first cadet to make her choice was Rodriguez. The Williams entity had explained the options with the kind of clinical precision that made cosmic forces sound like administrative decisions. Remain human, with all the limitations and mortality that entailed, or accept transformation into something eternal and powerful, capable of preventing future generations from facing impossible odds. Most species would have spent hours debating the philosophical implications. They would have analyzed the costs and benefits, consulted with religious advisors, and held formal councils to determine the proper course of action. Rodriguez listened to the explanation for exactly 30 seconds before interrupting. "Will I still be me?" she asked. The entity paused, considering the question with the careful attention it gave to all human inquiries that didn't make sense from a cosmic perspective. "You will retain your essential consciousness, your memories, and your fundamental decision-making patterns," it replied. "But you will also possess capabilities that transcend normal human limitations. You will exist across multiple dimensional states simultaneously. You will have access to the accumulated knowledge and experience of all preserved human heroes. But will I still be Maria Rodriguez from the Mars Urban Districts, who joined the Academy because she wanted to see the galaxy and maybe make her parents proud? You will remember being that person." The entity said carefully. But you will also be much more. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully, then looked around at her fellow cadets, still working to keep each other alive despite knowing their situation was hopeless. I want to stay human, she said simply. Sarah blinked in surprise. She had expected the cadets to be tempted by the offer of transcendence, of becoming something more than human with the power to protect others. Rodriguez was practical and ambitious, the kind of person who might see transformation as the ultimate career advancement. May I ask why? The Williams entity inquired, genuine curiosity evident in its voice. Because this is enough, Rodriguez replied, gesturing toward their improvised survival setup. Right here, right now, keeping Henderson breathing with a recycler built from spare parts and good intentions. This is what I signed up for. I don't need cosmic powers to help people. I just need to be human and stubborn and too stupid to give up. She looked at Sarah with a grin that was pure Rodriguez, confident and slightly rebellious. Besides, someone has to stay behind to tell the story properly. Immortal cosmic guardians probably aren't great at explaining things to Academy review boards. Sarah felt something tight in her chest loosen. Rodriguez was choosing to remain mortal, to accept the limitations of human existence, to be satisfied with ordinary heroism instead of transcendent power. It was possibly the most human decision anyone had ever made. The next choice came from Henderson, whose jury-rigged recycler was still keeping him alive through Rodriguez's engineering genius and stubborn refusal to let physics work properly. I want to ask a question first, Henderson said, addressing the Williams entity with the careful politeness he had shown to alien instructors throughout his academy training. The heroes you've preserved in those chambers, are they happy? It was such a fundamentally human question that Sarah saw the entity actually struggle to process it. Happiness wasn't a concept that cosmic forces usually considered when making decisions about the preservation of consciousness. They exist in a state of eternal purpose, the entity replied eventually. They experience continuous fulfillment through their role as guardians of human courage. They do not suffer from limitation, mortality, or failure. But are they happy? Henderson persisted. The Williams entity was quiet for a long moment, accessing data from sources beyond human comprehension. They expressed something analogous to satisfaction, it said finally. But happiness, as humans experience it, requires the possibility of unhappiness as a contrast. Eternal beings do not experience emotional states that depend on temporal variation. Henderson nodded, as if this made perfect sense to him. Then, I'll stay human too. I want to be unhappy sometimes, so I can appreciate being happy the rest of the time. Sarah shook her head in amazement. Henderson was choosing mortality, so he could experience the full range of human emotions, including the unpleasant ones. It was illogical, irrational, and absolutely typical of human decision-making. It was also probably the most philosophically sophisticated argument for remaining mortal that had ever been presented to cosmic entities. The choices continued, each cadet making decisions that revealed something fundamental about human nature. Kim chose to remain human because she wanted to grow up naturally, to make mistakes, and learn from them instead of being gifted with cosmic wisdom. Thompson wanted to see his home colony again and help his family with their farming problems, issues that didn't require transcendent powers, just ordinary human dedication. Martinez surprised everyone by choosing transformation. I want to make sure this never happens again, he said simply. Not the test, not the impossible situation. I understand why you need to identify human heroes. But I want to make sure no one else dies not knowing they had a choice. The senior cadet looked around at his classmates with the calm determination that had made him a natural leader. Someone needs to bridge the gap between humans and architects to help both sides understand each other better. I can do more good as a transformed guardian than as a regular officer. Sarah felt a pang of loss as Martinez stepped forward to accept transformation. She had watched him develop from a promising cadet into a natural leader, and now she was going to lose him to transcendence. But she also recognized the logic in his choice. Someone did need to serve as an intermediary between species, and Martinez had the temperament for it. The transformation process was surprisingly gentle. Martinez simply walked toward the Williams entity and was enveloped in the same dimensional shimmer that had surrounded Williams during his transition. When the light faded, Martinez still looked human, but there was something in his eyes that suggested vast depths of knowledge and experience. "I'm still me," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before. "But also more. I can see the connections between all the preserved heroes, understand their stories and their choices. It's beautiful." The next surprise came from Jackson, the quiet cadet who had been sharing Sarah's air supply through their improvised connection. "I want to ask about Commander Chun," he said, looking at Sarah with concern. "What happens to her? She's been keeping us alive this whole time, making impossible decisions and impossible repairs. Isn't she a hero, too?" The Williams entity turned its attention to Sarah, studying her with the kind of intense focus that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. "Commander Chun has demonstrated the qualities we seek to preserve," it acknowledged. "Her refusal to accept the impossible, her willingness to sacrifice herself for her subordinates, her ability to inspire courage in others. These are the characteristics that define human heroism. So she gets a choice too?" Jackson pressed. Sarah felt the entity's attention like a physical weight. She had been so focused on saving her cadets that she hadn't considered her own situation. But Jackson was right. She had been making the same impossible choices as Williams, the same refusal to accept death as the end of the story. "I get a choice," she said quietly, understanding flooding through her. "I can choose transformation too." The implications hit her like a physical blow. She could become something eternal, powerful, capable of preventing future tragedies. She could join Martinez and Williams as a bridge between humans and architects, helping to guide humanity's development in ways that prevented senseless deaths. Or she could remain Commander Sarah Chun of the Terran Defense Academy, mortal and limited and entirely human. "What would you choose, ma'am?" Kim asked quietly. Sarah looked around at her cadets, these young people who had made their own choices about transcendence and mortality based on their personal values and desires. Rodriguez wanted to remain human because ordinary heroism was enough for her. Henderson wanted to experience the full range of human emotions. Kim wanted to grow up naturally. Martinez wanted to prevent future tragedies. All valid choices, all reflecting different aspects of what it meant to be human. "I would choose to finish what I started," Sarah said finally. "I became a commander because I wanted to train the next generation of human leaders, to prepare them for the challenges they'd face in a galaxy that doesn't always make sense. I can't do that as a transcendent being. I need to stay human to understand human problems." She looked at the Williams entity, then at Martinez with his new depth of cosmic awareness. "But I think the Academy needs to know about this place, about the choices available to human heroes. We need to develop protocols for working with the architects, procedures for handling transformation offers, training programs that prepare cadets for decisions they never imagined they'd have to make." It was typical Saracen logic: turn a cosmic encounter into a training opportunity, transform a philosophical crisis into a practical problem that could be solved with proper procedures and adequate preparation. You would document this experience and integrate it into human military education, the Williams entity asked. "I would make sure future human heroes know what their options are," Sarah replied. "Choice requires knowledge. If you're going to offer transformation to dying heroes, they should understand what they're choosing between." The entity that had been Williams smiled with an expression that was both familiar and alien. "This is why humans fascinate us. You encounter the infinite and immediately want to write a training manual about it." Sarah shrugged. "It's what we do. We take impossible situations and figure out how to teach other people to handle them better than we did." The final choices were made quickly. Most of the cadets, chose to remain human, attracted by the messy complexity of mortal existence over the serene purpose of transcendence. 3 chose transformation. Martinez for his desire to prevent future tragedies, Williams because he had already died once and found existence interesting, and, surprisingly, Thompson, who decided he wanted to help protect the agricultural colonies that had raised him on a galactic scale. When the last choice was made, the facility around them began to stabilize. The dimensional barriers dissolved, the quantum cascade reaction wound down to manageable levels, and the toxic atmosphere cleared as normal environmental systems came back online. Sarah found herself standing in a perfectly ordinary training facility on Kepler 442b, surrounded by 19 human cadets and 1 commander, all breathing normal air and wearing functional environmental suits that no longer required jury-rigged repairs. The only evidence of their cosmic encounter was the absence of 4 cadets who had chosen transformation, and the memory of impossible conversations with beings who preserved human heroism in crystalline chambers. "So," Rodriguez said, breaking the stunned silence, "anyone else think the Academy Review Board is going to have some questions about our missing classmates?" Sarah laughed, a sound that carried relief and exhaustion and the particular brand of human humor that found something amusing in every impossible situation. "I'll handle the review board," she promised. "It's just another impossible situation that needs a practical solution." "What are you going to tell them?" Henderson asked. Sarah looked around at her surviving cadets, these young people who had faced transcendence and chosen mortality, who had been offered cosmic power and decided that ordinary human life was more interesting. "The truth," she said simply, "that they're training heroes, and heroes get to choose their own stories." 3 months later, Commander Sarah Chun stood before the Galactic Defense Council, delivering a briefing that would change humanity's relationship with the cosmos forever. The Hero Archives had been revealed as a joint human architect initiative, with transformed humans serving as bridges between species and ordinary humans working to develop protocols for managing transcendence encounters. The Academy had established new training programs, preparing cadets for the possibility that their heroic actions might attract attention from cosmic forces beyond human understanding. Emergency procedures were developed for dimensional cascade failures. Negotiation protocols were written for encounters with transcendent beings, and a new department was created to handle what the bureaucrats euphemistically called unusual career advancement opportunities. Rodriguez had been right about one thing. Review boards did have questions. Lots of questions. But they also recognized the value of having advance warning about cosmic encounters that could potentially draft their personnel into eternal service. Martinez, in his new role as human architect liaison, helped establish communication protocols that allowed both species to understand each other better. The architects learned about human concepts like choice and consent, while humans gained access to technologies and knowledge that had been preserved in the Hero Archives for millions of years. Williams used his unique perspective as someone who had experienced both human death and transcendent rebirth to develop new approaches to crisis counseling and trauma recovery. It turned out that having died once gave him unusual credibility when helping other people process difficult experiences. Thompson became the guardian of agricultural worlds throughout the galaxy, using his transcendent abilities to prevent famines, plagues, and natural disasters that threatened farming communities. He maintained his essential personality while gaining the power to protect the simple rural life he had always valued. But the most important change was philosophical. Humanity had learned that heroism wasn't just about dying for noble causes. It was about choosing to continue fighting impossible battles, whether as mortals with limited resources or as transcendent beings with cosmic powers. Heroes, it turned out, were defined not by their abilities or their mortality, but by their refusal to let other people face impossible odds alone. And in a galaxy full of impossible odds, that was exactly the kind of heroes the universe needed. Sarah Chun remained Commander Sarah Chun, training the next generation of human leaders to handle whatever impossible situations the galaxy might throw at them. She never regretted her choice to remain human, because every day brought new cadets who needed someone to show them that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they refused to give up on each other. Some of those cadets would eventually choose transformation when they faced their own impossible situations. Others would choose to remain mortal, finding meaning in the temporary nature of human existence. But they would all make those choices with full knowledge of what they were choosing between, because Sarah Chun had negotiated with cosmic forces and won the most important victory possible for her species: the right to write their own stories, whether those stories lasted for decades or for eternity. In the end, that was the most human thing of all, taking control of their own narrative, even when that narrative was being written by beings whose power exceeded their understanding. Heroes, after all, were just people who refused to let anyone else decide how their story should end.